Father Simeon Gallagher, OFM Captain, is the director of the Preaching Ministry Office for the Capuchin province of St. Conrad. Father Simeon's association at the Emmaus Program for Priests, devoted to teaching and itinerant preaching for priests, has earned him an international reputation. He has spoken and led retreats, parish missions, ecumenical events, workshops, and professional conferences throughout North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. So for the past several years, he has worked very closely with the U.S. Armed Forces at military bases around the world, and he was recently featured as a speaker in Athens, Istanbul, and Ephesus. Please join me in welcoming our keynote for tonight, Father Simeon Gallagher.
I haven't even met you. It's very nice to meet you. Good evening, everyone. First of all, let me expand on Father Christopher's greetings to you at the beginning of the evening. I am very grateful that you have opened up your schedules and you've come along with us for this wonderful evening. I want to extend a very warm welcome, especially to folks who might be joining us for the first time this evening. And I must admit that I place myself in that category. This is the 22nd year, if I'm not mistaken, of the brown robe. For many of those years, I was stationed in our friary in downtown St. Louis, in fact, for 27 years. And I am involved, as you just heard, with retreat work, and I'm away a lot. And since I've come back here to Denver in the last 4 or 5 years, I haven't been able to be here for the brown robe either. So I'm very happy to be with you, and I welcome all of you. The friars are very grateful for all of the good things that you do to support us in our ministries. You are remembered every day in our prayers in the friary, and I think it's important that you know that. And you can always turn to us for our support, especially in the area of prayer. I'm aware that we have chosen tonight this opening line from one of the loveliest prayers that is attributed to St. Francis, the peace prayer of St. Francis, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. This is a very, very famous prayer. It has been prayed down through the years by literally thousands and thousands of people. In fact, Princess Diana, in the depths of the most difficult times of her life, going through her divorce from Prince Charles and so forth, as she turned to the Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Basil Hume, to help her, to advise her. And he gave her the peace prayer of St. Francis, and there wasn't a day of the rest of her life that she did not pray this prayer. And in fact, the prayer was sung at her funeral. It is a very familiar prayer, and yet when Gina told me that that was going to be the theme of the evening, I tried to come up with a way of concretizing that, of making that practical and applicable to all of our lives. And this business about being practical and concrete is important. I learned that from my father. I mentioned when we had a backyard gathering in the summertime that my parents came from Ireland. They didn't know each other at home, but they met at an Irish dance in Philadelphia. And if you're ready for this, they courted for 12 years in the Irish fashion before they got married. And I remember asking my mother one time, Mom, 12 years? And she said, I wanted to be sure. And it will not surprise you when I tell you, with a name like Gallagher, that the family business was an Irish pub. You were listening this evening to the son of an Irish saloon owner. And when I went to my father years ago as a kid and asked if I could go to St. Fidelis to prepare for the priesthood as a Capuchin friar, my father was a happy-go-lucky Irish guy. I never remember him being terribly serious, but he got very serious, and he said to me, "If God is calling you to the priesthood, I want you to remember two things, and I never want you to forget them." And he kind of frightened me because I never saw him as so to speak, strict. And I said, "What are the two things you never want me to forget?" He said, "The first thing, I will hear more confessions at the end of this bar than you will hear in your whole life as a priest." And I'm sure he did. But the second thing my dad always said to me, if God is calling you to the priesthood and you have an opportunity to speak with people, be practical and be concrete. Don't send people home with a head full of ideas and no way to translate the ideas into their lives. And even though next month, on the 11th of November, my dad will be deceased for 44 years, he's not deceased. He's living in the back of my head, and every time I stand up to speak, I can hear my father knocking on the inside of my skull and saying to me, "Be practical." So when Gina told me that the theme of Instruments of Peace was chosen for this evening, I wanted to make that as practical as I possibly could. And so I went back through some of the reading that I have done in the last year. And there was a marvelous book written by the former Archbishop of Chicago, who recently died, Cardinal George. And he wrote this book called A Godly Humanism. And he said that the Catholic Church is not a movement based on ideas, that the Catholic Church is a communion based in relationships. And to me, that made a great deal of sense, because in the final analysis, it is all about relationships. This is the dimension of life where the rubber hits the road, and this is where we suffer some of the most bitter disappointments of life, but it's also within this area that we experience some of the greatest joys. God forgive me for quoting such a totally non-scriptural source as Liza Minnelli. But what she said about New York City could be said about the world of relationships. And what did Liza say? If you can make it, you can make it. You see, you know your Broadway. I'm proud of you. You can make it here. If you can make it in the world of relationships, you can make it anywhere. And when I looked across the province, I realized that that is what we are all about in our ministries. That is what the friars in our parishes in Kansas and Colorado are all about: building relationships, connecting people with one another, caring for each other. I certainly saw that several years ago. I had a bit of surgery because of skin cancers, and Brother Augustine, who runs the little clinic there at the Samaritan Shelter, took the stitches out, and I watched the way he interacted with all of the clients and the residents that come through the Samaritan Shelter. And it was perfectly clear to me that for him, these were not street people. These were human beings who were entitled to dignity and respect and esteem. He connected to them in terms of a relationship. And I saw the same thing last spring because the Little Sisters of the Poor invited me to come and do a day of recollection, reflection with the residents and the nuns. And I saw the same thing happening with those lovely senior people at the hands of Brother Anthony. We are all about relationships, and that is the purpose of our ministry. I'm thinking of the two wonderful clinical psychologists that we have in our province. Father David Sanji is here tonight, but Father Dwayne Reinert, who lives in Lawrence, Kansas, is not here as far as I know. But the clinical work that these men do is ultimately all about relationships, because this is what life presents to us and is the most important dimension of who we are. Now, before Gina tells me to be quiet, where do we get this emphasis, and where do we get this importance placed upon relationships? We get it from our faith tradition, that the fundamental revelation of God to us about himself is that he is a relationship of three persons in one Godhead. We call it the Blessed Trinity. If God himself exists in a relationship, then this becomes the model of all human interaction and all human behavior. We get this idea, the importance of relationships, by virtue of the incarnation, that God so loved the world that he sent his Son into the world, not to condemn the world, but to save the world. And even though he was God, he did not cling to his divinity, but he emptied himself and manifested himself in the midst of human relationships, not the least of which was family and marriage with Jesus, Mary, and Joseph at Nazareth. As friars, as Franciscans, as Capuchins, we also learn the importance of relationships from St. Francis himself, who says to us at one point in his writings, "I am so, so happy," he said, "because God has given me brothers." And it is all about relationships. St. Francis, and there are many, many stories that emphasize his appreciation of the uniqueness of the individual and the sacredness of each one of us. The friars in the beginning of Franciscan history didn't have very much, and they fasted and abstained primarily from meats. And someone gave a friary, where Francis was living, a huge slab of bacon, and one of the young friars, who wasn't quite into it yet in terms of discipline, etc., awakened in the middle of the night, screaming with hunger pangs. And he was embarrassed because he couldn't quite handle what the older friars could handle. And Francis made every friar in the house get out of bed and come down into the kitchen and cook that slab of bacon, and he made them sit and eat it so that that brother would not feel insufficient and perhaps not as capable as the rest. There was a respect for the human person. It's about relationships. And we certainly have heard this over and over again from our present Holy Father, because he stresses the unitedness of all creation. In this beautiful encyclical that he wrote on the environment, we are all of a piece. And every piece is important in the motif of God's beauty, God's creation, and God's power as he moves through the human community and the world of nature that is all around us. Every one of our ministries is tied to this idea of building relationships. And I cannot help but think that there are many people in this room this evening who are here precisely because one of the friars has passed through your life, and I would like to think he has charmed you and disarmed you. But you're here because of the impact that one of the friars has had. This business of relationships and taking care of each other, especially people who are not as fortunate as ourselves, is an essential dimension in all of our ministries. And without dragging this out tonight, I learned this from my mother. I went to a Catholic grade school in Philadelphia where there was no cafeteria. And we went home for lunch. My father's pub opened at 7 a.m. There were some heavy drinkers in the neighborhood. And they were there at 7 o'clock in the morning. My father would open. My mother would send my brother and I off to school with breakfast and so forth. And then she would come down and relieve my father so he could do some of the business angles for an hour or so. And then she wouldn't go back upstairs because the bar was on the street level and the family lived in the 2 floors above. And when I came home for lunch, my little red Flyer wagon was filled with Tupperware containers, soups that she had prepared, sandwiches that she had prepared. And before, she said to me, "You'll be fed before you go back to the nuns. But before I feed you, you're taking this food around the neighborhood." And they were mostly older people living alone, to a certain extent shut in their houses. She ran the original Meals on Wheels. And it was my little red Flyer wagon. But the importance, she taught me sensitivity to those who are not as fortunate. And she said, you take care of other people before you take care of yourself, and God will look after you. And so, I guess all the friars would join me in saying thank you, and our hopes are that what we do in caring for other people, ministering to other people, would rub off on you. Because we are all called to be instruments of the Lord's peace. One of my favorite poets, Gerard Manley Hopkins, says at the tail end of one of his gorgeous pieces of poetry, it's called As Kingfishers Catch Fire. Hopkins says, God plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his, but ours. We are the instruments of his peace. Thank you.